Before we begin tonight's journey, I want you to settle in completely. Let the sound of the rain wash over you. Find that comfortable position. Close your eyes if you'd like. And if you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing you these stories from around the world. Tonight, we're traveling to Lake Mead, Nevada, just 30 miles from the glittering lights of Las Vegas. Sunday, May 1st, 2022. A warm spring afternoon. The kind of day when families come to the lake for boating, fishing, swimming. The kind of day that should be filled with laughter and sunshine. But Lake Mead is dying. After more than 2 decades of drought, the worst in 1,200 years, the water level has dropped more than 170 feet since the year 2000. The bathtub ring on the rocky cliffs surrounding the lake tells the story. White mineral deposits mark where the water used to be, a ghost line stretching up the canyon walls like a scar. And as the water recedes, it reveals secrets. Sunken boats emerge from the depths like ancient shipwrecks. World War II-era infrastructure, submerged for 80 years, sees daylight again. And on this particular Sunday afternoon, something else appears. A boater near Hemingway Harbor spots something unusual in the mud along the newly exposed shoreline. Corroded metal barrel, rusty, partially buried. As the boater gets closer, they can see through the corrosion. Inside the barrel are human remains. A skeleton, still wearing clothes from decades ago, still wearing shoes. This body has been at the bottom of Lake Mead since the 1970s or early 1980s. For more than 40 years, this person has been missing. And now, as climate change drains the reservoir that provides water to 40 million people, the lake is giving up its dead. But this won't be the only body. Over the next 4 months, 3 more sets of human remains will surface. And each discovery will raise the same question that has haunted Las Vegas for half a century. How many bodies are at the bottom of Lake Mead? And how many of them are connected to the mob? This is the story of the vanishing at Lake Mead. The barrel body's mystery. A tale of drought and discovery, of old sins coming to light, and of a city built on secrets that the desert is finally ready to reveal. To understand what Lake Mead has become, we need to understand what it was meant to be. In the early 20th century, the American Southwest was a forbidding landscape. Desert, extreme heat, almost no water. The few settlements that existed clung to rivers and springs, surviving on the thin margin between life and death that water provided. Las Vegas was barely a town. A dusty railroad stop with a few hundred residents. Nothing more. Everything changed with the construction of Hoover Dam. Between 1931 and 1936, thousands of workers transformed Boulder Canyon on the Colorado River. They built what was then the largest concrete structure in the world. A monument to human ambition. A dam 726 feet tall, holding back the mighty Colorado River. And behind that dam, the water began to rise. Lake Mead, named after Elwood Mead, the commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation who had championed the project. At its maximum capacity, the reservoir stretches 112 miles upstream. It holds more than 9 trillion gallons of water. It's the largest reservoir in the United States by volume. A vast artificial sea in the middle of the desert. The creation of Lake Mead made Las Vegas possible. Suddenly, there was abundant water. Abundant electricity from the dam's generators. The city began to grow, and with growth came opportunity. Not all of it legal. By the 1940s, organized crime had discovered Las Vegas. Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo in 1946, ushering in the era of mob-controlled casinos. Over the next 3 decades, the Chicago outfit, the Kansas City mob, Milwaukee families, and Cleveland syndicates all had their fingers in Las Vegas pies. They controlled casinos. They skimmed profits. They laundered money. And when people got in the way, they disappeared. Lake Mead became useful for more than just water and recreation. It was deep. It was vast. It was convenient. A short drive from the Strip. Perfect place to dispose of evidence. A perfect place to make problems disappear. For decades, rumors circulated. Whispers in casino backrooms. Jokes among former mob lawyers. Stories about bodies in barrels. dumped in the lake, never to be seen again. But they were just stories, urban legends, the kind of thing people said about Las Vegas because of its reputation, not because of any evidence. Until May 1st, 2022. The drought that exposed the barrel had been building for more than 20 years. Since the year 2000, the Southwest has been experiencing what scientists call a megadrought. Climate change has made it worse. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation. Less snowpack in the Rocky Mountains means less runoff into the Colorado River. Less water flowing into Lake Mead. In 2000, the lake was at 96% of capacity. By 2022, it had fallen to just 27%. The bathtub ring, that white mineral deposit on the canyon walls, rose higher and higher. Marinas closed because the boat ramps no longer reached the water. The lake's first water intake valve, installed in 1971 and never meant to be exposed, emerged into the sunlight in April 2022. Las Vegas had to switch to a deeper intake valve, completed in 2020 specifically for this emergency. Without it, the city would have lost its water supply. 2.4 million residents, 40 million tourists per year, all dependent on a lake that was vanishing. And as the water receded, the lake began to give up its secrets. May 1st, 2022. Hemingway Harbor. The barrel is corroded badly enough that the boater who discovers it can see inside. Human remains. A skeleton, still clothed. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Homicide Lieutenant Ray Spencer is called to the scene. What he finds is something out of a crime novel. A body stuffed into a 50-gallon drum. Shot in the head. Execution style. The clothing and shoes suggest the victim died sometime in the mid-1970s to early 1980s. This isn't a recent crime. This is archaeology. This is history. This is a murder from half a century ago, preserved in the depths of Lake Mead, now returned to the surface by climate change. Lieutenant Spencer knows what everyone in Las Vegas knows. A body in a barrel is a signature mob hit. It's not just murder, it's a message. It's a disposal method that goes back to Prohibition-era Chicago. And in the 1970s, when this body was dumped into Lake Mead, Las Vegas was controlled by organized crime. The FBI is brought in. The Clark County Coroner's Office begins the painstaking work of identification. But after more than 40 years in the water, DNA is difficult to recover. There are no fingerprints left. The victim's face is unrecognizable. All they have are bones, clothing, and the manner of death. The clothing provides clues. Everything was purchased at Kmart, a discount store. Not the kind of attire a high-rolling mobster would wear. Not expensive. Not flashy. This was someone ordinary, someone working class, someone who, for reasons we may never know, ended up shot in the head and stuffed in a barrel. Jeff Schumacher, Vice President of Exhibits and Programs at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, is immediately contacted by reporters. He explains that disposing of bodies in barrels is indeed a classic mob technique. He cites the case of John Handsome Johnny Rosselli, a Chicago gangster whose decomposing remains were found in 1976 in a 55-gallon steel drum floating in Dumbfoundling Bay near Miami. Rosselli had been a key figure in the mob's control of Las Vegas and Hollywood. He had testified before the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence about an alleged CIA mafia conspiracy to assassinate Fidel Castro. 3 weeks after that testimony, he disappeared. His body was found in a barrel, dismembered, stuffed with heavy chains. A clear message from the mob. This is what happens to people who talk. The Lake Mead barrel murder has all the hallmarks of a similar hit. Someone the mob wanted dead. Someone who needed to disappear completely. Someone whose disappearance needed to send a message to others. But who? Immediately, speculation begins. Mob historians and crime reporters start compiling lists of men who disappeared from Las Vegas in the 1970s and early 1980s. Men with connections to organized crime. Men who were never found. 3 names surface most frequently. George J. Vandermark, a gambling machine cheater who the mob trusted to oversee the slot machine operation at the Stardust Casino on the Las Vegas Strip. Vandermark was skimming money from the casino. Money that was supposed to go to mob bosses in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. When the bosses discovered his double-cross, Vandermark knew he was in trouble. He disappeared in August 1976. His body has never been found, but investigators doubt the barrel victim is Vandermark. There are reports that Vandermark fled to Mexico and was killed there. Some believe his body was disposed of in Arizona. The Lake Mead barrel seems too convenient, too close to Las Vegas. The mob usually didn't like to leave evidence so close to home. William Crespo, a drug runner who got busted smuggling cocaine and decided to turn state's evidence. He was set to testify against a former insider from a mob-controlled casino company. But before he could make it to trial, he vanished in 1983. Crespo was in the witness protection program, but somehow the mob found him anyway. His body has never been found. Crespo is a possibility, a snitch, someone who betrayed the mob. The kind of person who would be killed as an example. The timeline fits. 1983 falls within the estimated time of death based on the clothing and shoes. But the strongest candidate, according to many mob historians, is Johnny Pappas. Panagiotakos Johnny Pappas was born in Greece and came to the United States as a young man. By the 1970s, he was working in Las Vegas casinos, the Castaways, the Las Vegas Hilton, Caesars Palace. These were mob-controlled properties. Pappas had connections. He knew people. He was trusted. By the mid-1970s, Pappas was managing Echo Bay Resort on Lake Mead. The resort was a Teamsters Central States Pension Fund Finance project, operated by the Argent Corporation. If those names sound familiar, they should. The Teamsters Pension Fund was essentially a mob bank. Argent Corporation was a front for organized crime interests. Echo Bay Resort was a mob operation, and Johnny Pappas was running it. On August 18, 1976, Johnny Pappas told his wife he was going to JoJo's restaurant on Las Vegas Boulevard South, near downtown Las Vegas, to meet someone interested in buying his boat. Pappas owned a boat docked at Lake Mead. He never came home. 4 days later, his car was spotted in the parking lot of the Circus Casino on the Strip. But Johnny Pappas was gone. Las Vegas police investigated his disappearance. They confirmed he had underworld connections, but they found no trace of him. No body, no witnesses, nothing. For nearly 50 years, Johnny Pappas has been a ghost. A question mark in Las Vegas mob history. One of the many men who disappeared during the violent 1970s when organized crime controlled the city. Could the body in the barrel finally be Johnny Pappas? The timeline fits. The Lake Mead connection fits. He worked at Echo Bay Resort. He owned a boat there. He knew the lake intimately. The method fits. A mob execution, a body disposal designed to send a message. But without DNA, without family members coming forward for testing, without any concrete evidence beyond circumstantial details, investigators can't confirm the identity. The man in the barrel remains nameless. The discovery of the barrel body sets off a frenzy. News crews descend on Lake Mead. Reporters interview mob historians, former police officers, family members of missing people. The story captures the public imagination. A mob mystery from the 1970s, literally surfacing after decades underwater. But if the drought exposed one body, what else might it reveal? On May 7, 2022, just 6 days after the barrel discovery, National Park Service Rangers receive a report of skeletal remains at Colville Bay, more than 9 miles from where the barrel was found. 2 sisters, Lindsay and Lynette Melvin, are paddle boarding on the lake. The water is too shallow for snorkeling, so they're exploring the newly exposed shoreline instead. They spot what they think at first is the skeleton of a bighorn sheep. These animals are native to the region, and it's not uncommon to find their remains in the desert. But as they get closer, they realize what they're looking at. Human jaw, teeth still attached. Skeletal remains partially buried in the sand of a newly surfaced sandbar. The sisters immediately report their discovery to park rangers. The Clark County Medical Examiner is called in. Initial analysis suggests the remains belong to a man between 23 and 37 years old. Unlike the barrel victim, these remains are more completely skeletal. No soft tissue, no clothing that has survived. The cause of death cannot be determined. There's no obvious evidence of foul play, though the coroner can't rule it out either. The discovery raises more questions than it answers. Who was this person? How long have they been in the lake? Was this a drowning? A murder? An accident? Lieutenant Ray Spencer, speaking to reporters, makes a prediction that chills everyone listening. I would say there is a very good chance as the water level drops that we are going to find additional human remains. He's right. On July 25, 2022, more skeletal remains are discovered at Swim Beach, near where the barrel was originally found. Then, on August 6th, yet another set of remains is found, also at Swim Beach. In just over 3 months, 4 sets of human remains have surfaced from Lake Mead. For people who vanished into the depths, now revealed by the receding waters. The question everyone asks, how many more bodies are down there? David Kohlmeyer, a former police officer who now co-hosts a Las Vegas podcast called The Problem Solver Show, offers a $5,000 reward for qualified divers to search for more barrels in the lake. He's immediately flooded with responses. Families of missing people reach out. Tips come in about cases from the 1980s and 1990s. A man suspected of killing his mother and brother in 1987. A hotel employee who disappeared in 1992. A father from Utah who vanished in the 1980s. Kohlmeyer tells reporters, "You'll probably find remains all throughout Lake Mead." He's not talking about just mob victims. He's talking about drowning victims, boating accidents, suicides, and yes, probably more murders. Native Americans who lived in the area for thousands of years. Travelers who died crossing the harsh desert before the lake existed. The land beneath Lake Mead has witnessed countless deaths over millennia. But it's the mob connection that captures everyone's imagination. Michael Green, a University of Nevada, Las Vegas history professor whose father dealt blackjack at mob-controlled casinos for decades, puts it succinctly, if the lake goes down much farther, it's very possible we're going to have some very interesting things surface. Oscar Goodman, former Las Vegas mayor and former defense attorney for mob figures including Tony the Ant Spilatro, is even more blunt. There's no telling what we'll find in Lake Mead, he says. It's not a bad place to dump a body. Goodman, speaking with his characteristic dark humor, recalls his time as mayor. When I was the mayor, every time I went to a groundbreaking, I'd begin to shake for fear that somebody I may have run into over the years will be uncovered. He notes that many of his former mob clients were very interested in climate control. Mob speak for keeping the lake level up and bodies down in their watery graves. To understand why bodies might be in Lake Mead, we need to understand Las Vegas in the 1970s and early 1980s. This was the height of mob control in the city. This was when organized crime owned Las Vegas. The Chicago outfit had been involved in Las Vegas since the 1940s, but by the 1970s their control was total. The Stardust, the Fremont, the Riviera, the Tropicana, these weren't just casinos. They were fronts, money laundering operations. The Chicago mob, along with families from Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland, was skimming millions of dollars from these casinos before the money could be officially counted and taxed. The operation was brilliantly simple. Before the casino revenue was logged in the official books, trusted individuals would skim cash from the counting rooms. This untaxed, undocumented money would be transported out of Nevada and distributed to mob bosses across the country. It was one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises in American history, but maintaining this operation required violence. Constant violence. People who stole from the mob. People who talked to law enforcement. People who got too ambitious or too careless. They all had to be dealt with. Enter Tony the Ant Spilatro. Anthony John Spilatro was born in Chicago in 1938. He was short, just 5'2", but ferociously violent. He earned his nickname the Ant because of his size, but anyone who underestimated him didn't live to regret it. By the 1960s, Spilatro was one of the Chicago outfit's most feared enforcers. In 1971, the outfit sent Spilatro to Las Vegas with one job: protect the skim. Watch the casino operations, make sure the money kept flowing to Chicago, and eliminate any threats to the operation. Spilatro took to the job with enthusiasm. He set up his own gang in Las Vegas, called the Hole in the Wall Gang, because they specialized in drilling through walls to burglarize homes and businesses. They ran bookmaking operations. They fenced stolen jewelry. They dealt drugs. And they killed people. If you asked the FBI in the 1970s and 1980s, they would tell you that Tony Spilatro was killing people or having people killed on a regular basis. Dozens of murders were attributed to him. Beatings, torture, bodies buried in the desert. And yes, bodies dumped in Lake Mead. The FBI had informants who reported that Spilatro had access to boats, that he and his crew would take problem individuals out onto Lake Mead at night, that sometimes those people didn't come back. But proof was hard to come by. Witnesses didn't want to testify. Bodies sank and weren't found. The lake kept its secrets. Some of the people who disappeared during Spilatro's reign of terror have never been found. Jay Vandermark, the slot manager who skimmed from the Stardust, vanished in 1976. Johnny Pappas, the Echo Bay resort manager, disappeared the same year. Both men were connected to casino operations. Both men would have known about the skim. Both men became liabilities. By the early 1980s, federal and state law enforcement agencies were closing in on the mob. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants. The walls were closing in. In 1986, Tony Spilatro and his brother Michael were lured to a meeting in Illinois. They were beaten to death and buried in an Indiana cornfield. Their bodies were found by a farmer plowing his field. The mob's control of Las Vegas ended in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Federal prosecutions, corporate takeovers of the casinos. The era of organized crime control was over. Las Vegas transformed from a mob playground into a legitimate corporate entertainment destination. But the bodies from that era, they remained, buried in the desert, hidden in the mountains, and some dumped in Lake Mead, preserved in the cold, deep water, waiting for the drought that would reveal them. By the end of 2022, Clark County Coroner's Office had completed DNA analysis on 3 of the 4 sets of remains found at Lake Mead. The results were both expected and surprising. Thomas Erndt, age 42 at the time of his death, disappeared in August 2002. He was reported to have drowned while swimming at Lake Mead. His remains were found in May 2022 in the Colville Bay area, the same location where the Melvin sisters found the second set of remains. DNA analysis confirmed his identity in August 2022. The cause of death, drowning. The manner, accidental. No mob connection, just a tragic accident that had gone unsolved for 20 years. Donald P. Smith, age 39 at the time of his death, disappeared in April 1974. He was also reported to have drowned. His remains were found in the Colville Bay area in October 2022. DNA confirmed his identity in 2023. Like Erndt, Smith's death was determined to be an accidental drowning. Another tragedy. Another family finally getting answers after nearly 50 years. But no organized crime connection. Claude Russell Pensinger, age 52 at the time of his disappearance, vanished in July 1998. His remains were found on the shoreline of Boulder Beach in the summer of 2022. DNA confirmed his identity in 2023. Unlike Erndt and Smith, Pensinger's cause and manner of death could not be determined. Too much time had passed. The remains were too deteriorated. But there's no evidence of foul play. Most likely another drowning or medical emergency while visiting the lake. 3 of the 4 sets of remains have been identified. 3 families finally have answers. 3 people who disappeared into Lake Mead decades ago, now named, now laid to rest properly. But the man in the barrel? He remains unknown. In November 2023, more than a year after the discovery, the FBI created facial approximation images based on the skull. Using advanced forensic imaging technology at the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, artists rendered what the man might have looked like in life. 3 angles, 3 simulated images showing a young man with dark hair, possibly of Southern European descent. The Clark County Coroner's Office released these images to the public, hoping someone would recognize the face, hoping a family member, a friend, someone who knew this man in the 1970s would see the images and come forward. So far, no one has. The coroner, Melanie Rouse, explained the challenge. As good as a DNA profile is, it's only as good as what you have to compare it to. We need family members to come forward for DNA testing. We need someone who remembers this person disappearing. We need a break, but the leads have dried up. The tips have stopped coming. The man in the barrel is still a ghost, still a question mark, still one of Las Vegas's many unsolved mysteries from the mob era. Investigators believe he was between 25 and 35 years old when he died. He was shot in the head, execution style. His clothing suggested working-class origins, Kmart purchases, nothing expensive, nothing flashy. He was dumped in Lake Mead sometime in the mid-1970s to early 1980s, at a time when Tony Spilatro and the Chicago outfit controlled Las Vegas with an iron fist. Who was he? Why was he killed? Who ordered the hit? These questions may never be answered. Unless someone comes forward, unless someone recognizes those FBI-generated images, unless some old mobster, now in his 80s or 90s, decides to unburden his conscience before he dies. As of December 2024, Lake Mead's water level has recovered slightly from its historic lows in 2022. Federal agreements between Nevada, Arizona, California, and the U.S. government have helped conserve water. The lake is now at about 31% of capacity. Still critically low, but better than the 27% it reached at its worst. The question everyone asks, will more bodies surface? The answer is almost certainly yes. Michael Green, the UNLV history professor, believes there are probably more remains in the lake. Not just mob victims, though those may exist, but drowning victims from the past 80 years. Boaters who disappeared, swimmers who never came back. Suicides, accidents. All the tragedies that can happen at a large body of water over 8 decades. And yes, possibly more mob hits from the 1970s and 1980s. Jeff Schumacher from the Mob Museum agrees. Nobody's really connected all the dots yet and all these missing figures from that era. But, maybe these bodies coming up at Lake Mead will reveal something to us. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Climate change, the same phenomenon that's creating this historic drought, is exposing crimes from half a century ago. The same environmental crisis that threatens water supplies for 40 million people is also revealing Las Vegas's violent past. The white bathtub ring on the canyon walls keeps rising. The shoreline keeps receding. And the desert keeps giving up its secrets. For the families of people who disappeared in Las Vegas in the 1970s and 1980s, the receding waters of Lake Mead offer a strange kind of hope. Maybe their loved one will be found. Maybe, after decades of not knowing, they'll finally get answers. Maybe they'll finally be able to bring their family member home. For mob historians and true crime enthusiasts, the lake's mysteries are endlessly fascinating. Each new discovery is a piece of the puzzle. Each identification, or failure to identify, adds to our understanding of that violent era when organized crime controlled America's most famous gambling destination. But for the man in the barrel, there is only silence. Only questions. Only the slow work of decomposition in a corroded steel drum at the bottom of Lake Mead for more than 40 years, until the drought brought him back to the surface. His name is unknown. His family, if they're still alive, doesn't know what happened to him. His story has been lost to time. All that remains is a skeleton, some Kmart clothing from the 1970s, and the bullet hole in his skull that tells us he died violently. The FBI images of his face circulate online. Shared and reshared, posted on true crime forums, discussed on podcasts. But so far, no one has come forward. No one has claimed him. He remains Lake Mead's greatest mystery. As the water level continues to fluctuate with the seasons and the climate, as drought continues to grip the American Southwest, Lake Mead will likely reveal more secrets. More barrels, perhaps. More bodies. More stories from Las Vegas's violent past. The lake that was created to bring life to the desert. Water for millions, power for cities, recreation for families, has also been a repository for death. A place where the mob buried its mistakes. A place where the sins of Las Vegas's past were meant to stay hidden forever. But nothing stays hidden forever. The desert has a way of revealing everything, eventually. And Lake Mead, as it slowly disappears, is telling its stories at last. Thank you for listening tonight. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe and leave a like to help us continue creating these deep investigations. Sleep well, and remember, even the deepest waters eventually give up their secrets. Story 2. Before we begin tonight's story, I want you to get comfortable. Find that perfect position. Let the sound of the rain create a peaceful space around you. And if you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing you these carefully researched stories. Tonight, we're traveling to Provincetown, Massachusetts, the very tip of Cape Cod, where the land curls like a finger into the Atlantic Ocean. July 26, 1974. A Friday morning. Summer in full bloom. The tourist season at its peak. The dunes stretching for miles, golden sand and beach grass, the sound of waves, the cry of seabirds. A 12-year-old girl is walking her beagle near Race Point. The dog is barking insistently, pulling at the leash, leading her towards something in the dunes. The girl follows, thinking maybe her dog has found a dead seal. It wouldn't be unusual. Things wash up on these beaches all the time. But what she finds isn't a seal. A woman lies face down on a beach blanket, naked, auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail with a gold-flecked elastic band. Her toenails are painted pink. For a moment, the girl might think the woman is sunbathing. But something is wrong, terribly wrong. The woman has been dead for weeks. Her hands have been removed, completely severed. The left side of her skull has been crushed. Her head is nearly detached from her body, resting on a pair of folded Wrangler jeans. A blue bandana lies nearby. The girl runs for help. Within hours, Provincetown becomes the center of one of Massachusetts' most enduring mysteries. A woman with no name, no fingerprints, no identification. Just a body in the dunes and questions that would haunt investigators for nearly 50 years. They would call her the Lady of the Dunes. And tonight, we're going to tell you her story. Because after 48 years of searching, investigators finally learned her name. Ruth Marie Terry. Born in Tennessee in 1936. A daughter, a sister, an aunt, a wife, a mother. Murdered at age 37 by a man she should have been able to trust. This is the story of how she was found. How she remained nameless for half a century. And how modern science finally gave her back her identity and revealed the monster she had married. Race Point in Provincetown sits at the northernmost tip of Cape Cod. It's part of the Cape Cod National Seashore, a protected area of pristine beaches and dunes. In the summer of 1974, it was a popular destination for tourists and locals alike. Beautiful, remote in places. The kind of landscape where you could walk for hours and see nothing but sand, sea, and sky. When police arrived at the scene that July morning, they found what would become one of the most puzzling crime scenes in Massachusetts history. The woman lay face down on half of a beach blanket. The other half of the blanket was underneath her, suggesting she might have been sharing it with someone. As if she'd been lying there with a companion, perhaps sleeping, when violence struck. There were no signs of a struggle in the sand around her. The beach blanket wasn't disturbed. Everything suggested she had either known her killer or had been attacked so suddenly that she couldn't resist. 2 sets of footprints led to the body. But the sand is loose at Race Point. The wind constantly reshapes the dunes. By the time police processed the scene, those footprints were already degrading. They found tire tracks about 50 yards away. But again, the soft sand and the passage of time made them almost useless as evidence. The woman's body was in an advanced stage of decomposition. Investigators estimated she had been dead for 10 days to 3 weeks before discovery. The summer heat and insect activity had accelerated decomposition. But even accounting for that, certain details were immediately clear. She was approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall. Athletic build. She weighed around 145 pounds. Her auburn or reddish hair was long, pulled back in a ponytail secured with that distinctive gold-flecked elastic band. Her toenails were painted pink, a small detail that spoke of care, of someone who took pride in her appearance. But the manner of her death was brutal. The left side of her skull had been crushed. The blow had been devastating, delivered with tremendous force. That was the cause of death, according to the medical examiner. One massive blow to the head, and then there were the mutilations. Both hands had been severed and removed. Not during the attack, investigators believed, but after death. The killer had taken her hands. Why? The obvious answer: to prevent identification through fingerprints. Several of her teeth had been removed as well. Again post-mortem. Again, seemingly to prevent identification. Dental records are one of the most reliable ways to identify a body. If you remove the teeth, you remove that possibility. Her head was nearly severed from her body. The killer had tried to decapitate her, but hadn't finished the job. The brutality was shocking even to experienced homicide investigators. This wasn't just murder. This was overkill. This was rage. Or perhaps cold, calculated destruction of evidence. The clothing at the scene told its own story. The Wrangler jeans under her head. The blue bandana. Both items appeared to have been purchased at Kmart, a discount retailer. Nothing expensive. Nothing distinctive. Just ordinary clothes that could have been bought at any of thousands of Kmart stores across the country. No weapon was found. No identification. No purse. No keys. Nothing that might tell investigators who this woman was or where she came from. Provincetown Police Chief James Meads took charge of the investigation. His department was small, adequate for handling petty crime and tourist issues, but not equipped for a murder investigation of this magnitude. The Massachusetts State Police were brought in immediately. The FBI would later join the investigation. The first priority was identification. Who was this woman? Chief Meads and his team began the painstaking work of checking missing persons reports. They looked at cases from Massachusetts first, then expanded to neighboring states, then nationwide. Thousands of cases. Thousands of missing women, but none of them matched. They created a composite image based on the victim's skull structure and remaining features. They distributed it to police departments across the country. They showed it on the news. They published it in newspapers. Someone somewhere must know who this woman was. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months. No one came forward. No one reported a missing person who matched the description. It was as if this woman had never existed. As if she had simply materialized in the dunes of Provincetown to die. By October 1974, with no leads and no identification, the decision was made to bury her. St. Peter the Apostle Cemetery in Provincetown. A simple grave. A simple headstone that read, "Unidentified female body found Race Point, Dunes, July 26, 1974. The Lady of the Dunes." That's what people started calling her. A nickname that would stick for nearly 50 years. A placeholder for a woman whose real name was lost to time. The investigation into the Lady of the Dunes never truly stopped, but it did slow. Without a name, without a suspect, there was only so much investigators could do. They followed every lead that came in. They investigated every tip. But year after year, the case remained cold. In 1980, 6 years after her burial, the decision was made to exhume her body. Advances in forensic science offered new possibilities. Maybe there was something they'd missed. Maybe new techniques could reveal something that 1974 technology couldn't detect. The exhumation didn't solve the case, but it did preserve evidence for future testing. The body was reburied, and the investigation continued. In 1982, the Provincetown Police Department turned the case over to the Massachusetts State Police. The state police had more resources, more experience with cold cases. Maybe fresh eyes could see something that had been missed. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, investigators continued to pursue leads. They pored over missing persons cases. They interviewed people who had been in Provincetown in the summer of 1974. They checked vehicle registrations for cars that had been driven through the area. Every lead was a dead end. In 2000, the body was exhumed again. DNA technology had advanced significantly since the 1980s. This time, they extracted DNA and created a genetic profile. They had her genetic signature now. They just needed something to compare it to. Her DNA was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. It was checked against missing persons databases. It was compared to DNA from unidentified remains found in other locations. No matches. In May 2010, forensic experts created a new composite image using more advanced reconstruction techniques. They wanted to show what the woman might have looked like in life. The image was more detailed, more lifelike than previous attempts. It was distributed to media outlets across the country. Once again, investigators hoped someone would recognize her. No one did. In 2013, the body was exhumed for a third time. More advanced DNA testing, more samples collected, but still no identification. Over the decades, theories proliferated. Some investigators believed the victim might be connected to organized crime. The 1970s were a violent time in the Boston underworld. Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang controlled much of the city's criminal activity. They were known to dispose of bodies in creative ways. Could the Lady of the Dunes have been a mob victim? The theory had some appeal. The removal of hands and teeth suggested someone with criminal knowledge. The brutal overkill suggested mob violence. And Provincetown, while not directly controlled by Boston's Irish mob, was within their sphere of influence. But there were problems with the mob theory. Mob victims were usually men involved in criminal activity. Women connected to the mob were rarely killed, and when they were, their bodies usually weren't found. The mob was good at making people disappear completely. Why would they leave this body in such a public place, where it was certain to be discovered? Some believed the killer might be a serial killer. The 1970s saw the rise of several active serial killers in the United States. Ted Bundy was killing women across multiple states. Other predators were active as well. Could the Lady of the Dunes have been the victim of a traveling serial killer? In 2004, a man named Haddon Clark, a convicted serial killer, claimed responsibility for the murder. Clark was serving time for killing 2 women in Maryland. He had a history of making false confessions and giving investigators inaccurate information. His claim about the Lady of the Dunes was investigated but couldn't be substantiated. Like so many other leads, it went nowhere. Then, in 2015, something unusual happened. Author Joe Hill, the son of horror writer Stephen King, was watching the movie Jaws when he noticed something. In a crowd scene filmed on Martha's Vineyard, he spotted a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the composite images of the Lady of the Dunes. Jaws had been filming on Martha's Vineyard in the summer of 1974, the exact time and general location of the murder. Martha's Vineyard is about 100 miles south of Provincetown, but it's the same region, the same coastal Massachusetts area. Hill posted about his observation online. The theory went viral. True crime enthusiasts began freeze-framing every second of Jaws, looking for this mysterious extra. Some claimed they could see her. Others were skeptical. Investigators looked into the theory. They tried to track down information about the extras used in Jaws. But the production had used hundreds of locals as extras, and records from 1974 were incomplete. The theory couldn't be proven or disproven. It remained another tantalizing possibility in a case filled with dead ends. By 2020, the Lady of the Dunes had become a legend. Web sleuths devoted entire forums to discussing her case. Podcasters covered her story. Documentary filmmakers profiled her mystery. She had become a symbol of all the Jane does across America. Women who died violently and were never identified, never claimed, never given their names back. But technology was advancing, and investigators were about to make a breakthrough: investigative genealogy. It's a relatively new technique that combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research and historical records. It's the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer in California. the same technology that identified the Grim Sleeper. And in 2022, it would finally give a name to the Lady of the Dunes. Here's how it works. Investigators take the victim's DNA profile and upload it to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. These are databases where people voluntarily upload their DNA results from consumer tests like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, hoping to find long-lost relatives or learn about their ancestry. When a DNA profile is uploaded, the database searches for genetic matches. Not exact matches. Those are rare unless you're looking for an identical twin. But partial matches. People who share enough DNA to be relatives. Third cousins. Fourth cousins. Distant family members who share a common ancestor. Once investigators have a list of genetic matches, the real detective work begins. They build family trees. They trace lineages backwards through time, looking for the common ancestor. Then they work forward, tracking all the descendants of that ancestor. It's painstaking work that can take months or even years. They're looking for someone who fits the profile. The right age, the right geographic location, someone who disappeared around the right time. They eliminate people who are still alive. They eliminate people who died in documented ways in different locations. They narrow down the possibilities until they have a list of candidates. Then comes the critical step, verification. They need to confirm that their candidate is actually the victim. This usually involves finding a close relative, a child, a sibling, a parent, who's willing to provide a DNA sample for direct comparison. In the case of the Lady of the Dunes, this process began in earnest in 2021. The Massachusetts State Police, working with the FBI and a private genealogy company, uploaded her DNA profile to public databases. They got hits, distant relatives, people who shared genetic markers with the victim. The genealogists built family trees. They traced connections across multiple generations. They identified a family from Tennessee, the Terrys, and within that family, they found someone who fit the profile. Ruth Marie Terry, born September 8, 1936, in Tennessee. She had disappeared sometime in 1974. Her family had reported her missing, but the missing persons report had never been connected to the body in Provincetown. Different state, different law enforcement agencies, different databases that didn't talk to each other in the 1970s. The genealogists reached out to Ruth's family. They explained what they had found. They asked if anyone would be willing to provide a DNA sample for comparison. Family members agreed. DNA was collected. It was sent to the lab for analysis. And in October 2022, the results came back. Positive match. The Lady of the Dunes was Ruth Marie Terry. On October 31st, 2022, Halloween, appropriately enough for a case that had haunted Massachusetts for nearly 50 years, the FBI held a press conference in Boston. Special Agent Joseph Bonavolante stood before a room full of reporters. Behind him were photographs. Ruth Marie Terry as a young woman, smiling, beautiful, full of life. Next to those photographs were the composite images of the Lady of the Dunes, the Jane Doe who had been nameless for 48 years. "We can finally say her name," Bonavolante said. Ruth Marie Terry. The room was silent. After decades of frustration, after generations of investigators who had worked this case and retired without solving it, after 48 years of this woman being known only as a victim, she had her identity back. Ruth Marie Terry, daughter, sister, and wife, mother. But identifying her was only half the battle. Now came the harder question. Who killed her? And why was she in Provincetown in July 1974? Ruth Marie Terry was born in Whitwell, Tennessee, a small town in the southeastern part of the state. She grew up in the South during the 1940s and 1950s. She had siblings, extended family, people who loved her and remembered her. Photographs from her youth show an attractive woman with that distinctive auburn hair. She was athletic, healthy, the kind of person who took care of herself. The pink painted toenails that had been such a haunting detail in the crime scene photographs, that was Ruth taking care of herself, maintaining her appearance, living her life. By the 1970s, Ruth had been married previously and had children, but that marriage had ended. She was living in California, trying to start over, trying to build a new life. And then she met Guy Rockwell Moldavin. Moldavin was an antiques dealer, or so he claimed. He was charming, educated. He spoke well. He had stories about his background, educated in Switzerland and Connecticut, raised on a cattle ranch in New Mexico. He seemed worldly, sophisticated. On February 16, 1974, Ruth Marie Terry married Guy Moldavin in Reno, Nevada. She was 37 years old. He was 50 years old. To the outside world, they might have seemed like any middle-aged couple starting a new chapter together. But Ruth's family noticed something immediately. When the couple visited Ruth's relatives in Tennessee shortly after the wedding, Ruth seemed different, withdrawn, not herself. Her grandniece, Brittany Navanglaski, would later recall that Ruth wasn't herself whenever she was with Moldavin. He was possessive, controlling. He rarely let her out of his sight. The couple visited Ruth's half-brother, Kenneth, and his wife Carol in Chattanooga. Kenneth and Carol later remembered the newlyweds saying they were going to travel across the United States looking for antiques to buy and sell. It was supposed to be a working honeymoon, an adventure. Kenneth specifically remembered them mentioning Massachusetts as one of their destinations. That detail would become crucial decades later. Rain softened slightly. After leaving Tennessee, Ruth and Guy disappeared into the vastness of America's highways. Two people in a car, driving from town to town, supposedly looking for antiques. But somewhere along that journey, something went terribly wrong. In late July or early August 1974, Guy Moldavin returned to Tennessee alone. He showed up at Ruth's family's home with a story. Ruth had gone missing, he said. She had disappeared from their California home. He didn't know where she was. He seemed concerned, but his concern seemed hollow, performative. Ruth's sister-in-law, Jan Terry, later recalled that Moldavin stayed for only a short time. He told the family he didn't know where Ruth was, and then he left. He didn't seem particularly interested in searching for her. He didn't file a missing persons report. He just moved on. The family was confused, worried, but what could they do? This was 1974. Missing persons cases weren't investigated the way they are today. If an adult wanted to disappear, that was their right. The police wouldn't necessarily get involved unless there was evidence of foul play. And Guy Moldavin seemed so calm, so unconcerned. If he wasn't worried, should they be? One of Ruth's aunts didn't believe him. She launched her own investigation, trying to track down what had happened to her niece. But she didn't have the resources of law enforcement. She didn't have access to databases or forensic evidence. She made lists. She asked questions. She never stopped believing that something terrible had happened. That aunt is now deceased. But investigators in 2022 and 2023 worked to retrieve whatever records she had gathered. Every piece of information helped build the case against the man they now suspected. Because by the time Ruth's body was found in the dunes of Provincetown, Guy Moldavin was long gone. And investigators were about to discover that Ruth wasn't the first woman to disappear after marrying him. Guy Rockwell Moldavin was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in October 1923. He was adopted by Abram Albert Zadwaransky Moldavin and Sylvia Lily Silverblatt. He grew up privileged. His family owned a cattle ranch. He was educated at private schools. He studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York. He wanted to be an actor, a professor, a man of culture and refinement. In 1946, he married his first wife, Jo Ellen Loop. They opened an antique shop together in Seattle, Washington. The marriage lasted about 10 years before they divorced in 1956. This marriage ended without violence, without disappearances. By all accounts, it was a normal divorce. But Moldavin's second marriage was very different. On September 30th, 1958, Guy Moldavin married Manzanita Aileen Ryan in Kootenai, Idaho. Manzanita, called Manzi by friends, had been married before and had children from that previous marriage. Her oldest daughter, Dolores Mearns, was 18 years old and attending college. The story of how they met has an eerie quality. Manzanita and her then-husband, William Mearns, had walked into Moldovan's antique shop in Seattle. Moldovan was immediately smitten with Manzanita. He pursued her, charmed her, convinced her to leave her husband. According to newspaper accounts from the time, Manzanita was normally described as calm and self-contained, but she became distraught during the courtship. She sought treatment from a doctor because of her anxiety, but she married Moldovan anyway. For a while, things seemed normal. Manzanita and Dolores lived in Moldovan's house on Fairview Avenue in Seattle. Dolores moved into a second-floor bedroom. She continued her college studies. Manzanita and Dolores would visit the younger children. Manzanita's children from her previous marriage, once a month in Vancouver, maintaining family connections. Then, in March 1960, the visits stopped. In April, when Manzanita and Dolores failed to show up for their regular visit, 14-year-old Anita Mearns called her stepfather. "Where's my mother?" she asked. "She's been ill," Moldovan told her. Rain creates an ominous atmosphere. By May, William Mearns, Manzanita's ex-husband and Dolores' father, was worried enough to call Seattle police. He reported both women missing. Police began investigating, and that's when things got complicated. Because around the same time Manzanita and Dolores disappeared, Moldovan had met someone new, Evelyn Emerson. She was the stepdaughter of Jermaine Winkler, a woman who had come into his antique shop. Moldovan, still married to the missing Manzanita, was smitten once again. On July 22, 1960, while his second wife was still officially missing, Moldovan married Evelyn Emerson. Then, on July 26th, he divorced Manzanita on desertion charges. The timing was suspicious. The audacity was stunning. 5 days after the wedding, Moldovan borrowed $10,000 from Jermaine Winkler, Evelyn's stepmother. He claimed he needed the money to buy antiques in Canada for quick resale. It was a scam. He had no intention of buying antiques or returning the money. And then, in August 1960, Seattle police executed a search warrant at Moldovan's house on Fairview Avenue. In the septic tank, recently sealed, they found human remains, bits and pieces of bodies. The remains of Manzanita Rockwell and Dolores and Mearns. Moldovan fled. He made it to San Francisco, then to New York. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. In December 1960, federal agents tracked him down to a Greenwich Village apartment in New York City. He was renting the place under the name Michael Strong. When agents broke down the door, they found a man who stood 6'2" and weighed close to 250 pounds, with brown hair dyed red, a hulking presence trying to hide in an artist's loft. He was arrested, charged with unlawful flight to avoid giving testimony before a grand jury. The newspapers had a field day. Hipster, bunco artist, and great lover. The Daily News called him. They described his apartment as curio-cluttered. They painted him as a con man, a fraudster, a man who left chaos wherever he went. But here's what's remarkable. Despite finding the remains of his wife and stepdaughter in his septic tank, despite the clear evidence that he had killed them, King County prosecutors admitted they didn't have enough physical evidence to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. This was 1960. Forensic science was limited. DNA didn't exist as an investigative tool. The bodies were too deteriorated. Moldovan sat in jail for 13 months, but he was never charged with murder. Instead, he went on trial for grand larceny, the $10,000 he had stolen from Jermaine Winkler. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But in 1962, on appeal, he agreed to repay the stolen money. His sentence was suspended. He walked free. Guy Moldovan had gotten away with murder, twice. A wife and a stepdaughter, their bodies in his septic tank, and he walked out of jail after 13 months. And 14 years later, he would marry Ruth Marie Terry. Once investigators identified Ruth Marie Terry in October 2022, the next step was obvious. They needed to find out everything they could about her life, where she lived, who she knew, who she was connected to, and that's when they discovered the marriage record. February 16th, 1974. Ruth Marie Terry, also known as Terry Marie Vizina, married Guy Rockwell Moldovan in Reno, Nevada. Investigators immediately began researching Moldovan, and what they found horrified them. This wasn't just a bad husband. This was a suspected serial killer who had already gotten away with murder once. Moldovan had died in 2002 in California at age 78. He had lived out his final years in Salinas, California, working as a volunteer late-night host at a public radio station. By all accounts, he had led a quiet retirement. His neighbors had no idea about his dark past. No idea that the pleasant older man who talked about books and music might have killed multiple women. Massachusetts State Police and the FBI began building their case. They interviewed Ruth's family members. They traced Ruth and Guy's movements in early 1974. They confirmed that the couple had visited Tennessee. They confirmed that Guy had mentioned visiting Massachusetts. They found witnesses who remembered the couple, who remembered Ruth seeming uncomfortable around her new husband. And they found the family member who had the most chilling story. The one who recalled Guy returning to Tennessee in late summer 1974 with that hollow explanation. "She's gone missing. I don't know where she is." On August 28, 2023, the Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office made an announcement. Based on their investigation into the death of Ruth Marie Terry, they had determined that Guy Rockwell Moldovan was responsible for her death in 1974. It wasn't a trial. There would never be a trial. Moldovan had been dead for 21 years. But the announcement gave Ruth's family the one thing they had been denied for nearly 50 years: certainty. They knew who had killed her. They knew that she hadn't abandoned them, hadn't chosen to disappear. She had been murdered by the man she had trusted enough to marry. The case also revealed something else. Investigators believe Moldovan may have killed before Manzanita and Dolores. In 1950, a bread truck driver named Henry Lawrence Redbeard was found dead under suspicious circumstances. His girlfriend, 17-year-old Barbara Jo Kelly, disappeared around the same time. Both had worked at a restaurant owned by the family of Moldovan's first wife. Moldovan was questioned about those deaths but never charged. Like so many aspects of his life, he slipped away from consequences. Moved on to the next town, the next identity, the next victim. How many women did Guy Moldovan kill? We know of at least 3, Manzanita, Dolores, and Ruth. But there may be more. Women who disappeared during his travels. Women whose bodies were never found. Women who became ghosts like Ruth almost did. Today, if you visit St. Peter the Apostle Cemetery in Provincetown, you'll find Ruth Marie Terry's grave. The headstone has been updated. It no longer reads, "Unidentified female body." It bears her name now, Ruth Marie Terry. Born September 8, 1936. Died July 1974. The Race Point Dunes where she was found look much the same as they did 50 years ago. The sand, the beach grass, the Atlantic stretching to the horizon, is still beautiful, still remote, still peaceful. Tourists still walk those beaches, never knowing the tragedy that unfolded there in the summer of 1974. But Ruth is no longer the Lady of the Dunes. She's no longer a mystery. She's no longer a Jane Doe whose story ended with questions. She has her name back. Her family knows what happened to her. And the world knows that Guy Rockwell Moldovan, for all his charm and education and sophistication, was a monster who killed the women who trusted him. Investigative genealogy gave Ruth back her identity. It gave her family closure. And it serves as a warning to other killers. You cannot hide forever. Time doesn't erase justice. It only delays it. 48 years is a long time. But Ruth Marie Terry's name has been restored. Her killer has been identified. And while he'll never face trial, he'll never escape the judgment of history. Thank you for listening tonight. If the story moved you, please subscribe and leave a like to help us continue bringing you these carefully researched true crime stories. Sleep well, and remember, even the coldest cases can be solved when we refuse to give up on the victims who deserve to have their names remembered.